9. Sherice Cleveland. One morning in June of 2021, a middle-aged woman asked McDonald's workers in Ravenna, Ohio, to mix 3 different slushy flavors into one drink for her. The manager said that they couldn't do that, but the customer persisted and became increasingly confrontational. She eventually tried going behind the counter to mix the slushy herself, at which point a nearby customer started filming the ordeal with his phone. Brian Allen later told local outlet WOIO that he decided to hit the record button because he was worried that the disgruntled woman would hurt someone, and he wanted to have video evidence in case the police got involved. His foresight paid off when what started as a verbal disagreement became physical. The footage showed the customer throwing a cup of ice and punching a worker in the eye. An all-out brawl ensued as the employee tackled the woman to the ground and punched her repeatedly in the face. Police soon arrived at the scene and led the combative customer away in handcuffs. They charged 44-year-old Sherice Cleveland with 2 counts of misdemeanor assault. She was found guilty and apologized for her behavior in court. Cleveland said that she was embarrassed about the incident and that she was in counseling to address her issues. 8. Trio trashes restaurant. In an unprovoked attack that went viral on TikTok in July 2022, a trio of women in their 20s completely trashed a Big Apple restaurant and injured a worker. The customers requested extra sauce for their fries at Bell Fries on Manhattan's Lower East Side, and were told that they would have to pay $1.75 for it. They erupted into a tirade and started destroying things throughout the restaurant, including computers and a cash register. They threw items at terrified staff members who stood by and watched in horror. The women seemed amused by their behavior. At one point, 2 of them took a break from hurling objects to stand on the counter and twerk. They caused an estimated $25,000 in damages. At least one employee was hurt in the colossal tantrum and ended up in the hospital. All 6 workers who were on duty at the time were left so traumatized afterward that they were afraid to return to work, according to the restaurant's owner, who spoke with NBC4. Pearl Osoria, Shitara Placentia, and Tatiana Johnson face charges of robbery, criminal mischief, assaulting an officer, resisting arrest, and disorderly conduct. The owner of Bell Fries condemned the bystanders who watched the destruction play out for cheering the women on rather than coming to the aid of employees. Sadly, the restaurant has been closed ever since the ordeal. 7. Antoine Sims. After receiving a call about a dispute at a local McDonald's one day in 2022, police in Kennesaw, Georgia arrived to find 24-year-old Antoine Sims giving the manager a hard time over some cold fries. He also claimed that he never got a receipt and that the manager had touched the fries with his bare hands. Both parties told officers that they had gotten into a shouting match. The manager wanted Sims removed from the property for trespassing, but the unruly customer refused to leave and continued to complain about his fries to the police. Body cam footage later showed Sims saying to an officer, "They're lukewarm, but they're not hot." The fries would soon be the least of the man's worries. As he filled out some paperwork for a criminal trespass notice, officers ran his ID and saw that he was wanted for a murder that happened back in 2018. When the police told Sims that he was under arrest, he took off on foot. They apprehended him 20 minutes later. Sims is accused of 21-year-old Adalisa Muratovic in a drug deal gone wrong, then driving her car to another neighborhood with her body inside and lighting it on fire. He failed to appear in court for the homicide and had somehow managed to fly under the radar until he couldn't contain his emotions over some fast food. 6. George Santiago. Early one morning in 2022, a man tried to visit a Chase bank on Manhattan's Upper East Side before it opened for the day and demanded that the guard let him inside. He was sent away, but returned later that morning and flew into a rage when a teller told him that the services he needed could only be performed over the phone. Employees asked the man to leave and called security. While being escorted out, the belligerent customer pulled a knife and stabbed the guard in the neck inside the bank's vestibule, then ran off and disappeared into a nearby subway station. The guard was rushed to the hospital where he underwent emergency surgery. He pulled through, but was still in critical condition at the last update. Police identified the suspect as 34-year-old George Santiago, who lives about 10 blocks from the bank, according to the New York Daily News. They caught up with him in the Bronx hours later and found 2 knives in his possession. Santiago was charged with attempted murder, assault, and possession of a weapon. According to police, he's been arrested at least 4 times in the last 14 years and served 5 months in prison after being convicted in a 2017 assault in the Bronx. His latest arrest came amid an ongoing crime surge in the Big Apple that many blame on the increasingly lenient policies toward offenders that have been introduced in New York in recent years. Only time will tell whether Santiago will benefit from the soft-on-crime culture that seems to have become the status quo among state and city leaders. 5. Melvin Williams. A customer needlessly resorted to violence when he was unsatisfied with his food during a visit to an Atlanta Subway restaurant in 2022, leaving one worker dead and another fighting for her life. 36-year-old Melvin Williams allegedly became angry because there was too much mayonnaise on his sandwich. Instead of addressing the problem rationally, he began arguing with employees. They escorted him out of the restaurant, at which point he pulled a gun and began firing inside. 24-year-old Jada Statham, who was at her workplace with her 5-year-old son, had already pushed the little boy under the counter to protect him from Williams. Just moments before the onslaught of bullets began, she was shot twice while shielding him and was taken to the hospital in critical condition. Her coworker, best friend, and roommate, 26-year-old Brittany McCone, was killed. The women had started working at the restaurant together just weeks before the shooting. In the short time they were there, they were model employees, according to co-owner Willie Glenn, who spoke with Channel 2 Action News. Statham faces a long road to recovery from both her physical injuries and her grief over losing her best friend. In the meantime, Williams is behind bars on suspicion of murder and aggravated assault, marking at least the 8th time he's landed himself in the Fulton County Jail. Many were shocked to learn that at the time of the shooting, he was out on bond for allegedly choking the mother of his child during a domestic dispute last year. As a condition of his release, Williams was banned from owning a weapon, but his history and the accusations he faces are a good reminder that some criminals never learn to respect the law. 4. Quinnisha Thompson. After receiving what she later described as a watery blizzard from a Dairy Queen in College Station, Texas, 2021, 28-year-old Quinnisha Thompson asked for either a refund or a new blizzard. A verbal altercation ensued, and it ended with Thompson hitting 2 workers with her car. She told police that when she complained about her ice cream, the employees started taunting her and laughing at her, and that one staff member removed their headset and challenged her to a fight. Thompson said that she pulled around the drive-thru with plans to get out of her car and fight the worker, but when she noticed several employees heading toward the exit, she drove up on a concrete block in an attempt to block the door and stop them from coming outside. The vehicle struck 2 workers, causing them to fall backwards and leaving them both with leg injuries. Armed with their own version of events, the employees told police that they offered Thompson a refund but needed her to sign the credit card receipt for it. The disgruntled customer allegedly became combative, prompting 2 workers to go outside to capture photos of her car and license plate so that they could report her to the law enforcement. They said that Thompson drove up onto the concrete block as they were walking outside, and that they feared for their lives throughout the ordeal. While the parties gave conflicting stories about the confrontation, surveillance footage confirmed that Thompson drove up to the restaurant's door and hit the employees. According to a police report, officers ultimately sided with the workers and charged Thompson with 2 counts of assault with a deadly weapon. She was taken to the Brazos County Jail and held on bonds totaling $30,000. 3. Allison Colleti. Early one morning in 2022, a woman went to a Denny's restaurant in Leesburg, Florida with a male companion and tried to order grits. The server told her that grits wouldn't be available until later that day, and she immediately became upset and argumentative. Suspecting that the woman was drunk, a staff member called 911. In the meantime, the pair left the restaurant. The woman got behind the wheel of a truck and started to go back out of the parking space, but was stopped by a police officer who arrived at the scene just in time. She didn't notice the cop until he tapped on her window to get her attention. The disgruntled customer, later identified as 52-year-old Allison Colleti, allegedly demanded to know why the police were there. She denied any wrongdoing and said that she just wanted to eat some turkey and dressing. In maintaining her innocence, Colleti claimed that she hadn't been drinking, but officers could smell alcohol and noticed that her eyes were bloodshot. She was also reportedly unable to follow basic directions and refused a field sobriety test. At that point, an officer told Colleti that she was under arrest and handcuffed her. Suddenly, she changed her tune and said that she was willing to do a sobriety test. But when the cops uncuffed her, she allegedly threatened to fight him. She then refused a breathalyzer, but eventually admitted that she had been drinking. Colleti was charged with felony DWI and refusing to take a breathalyzer test. She already had 3 DWI convictions under her belt, meaning that she could face more serious consequences than she has in the past if convicted, including possible prison time and permanently losing her driver's license. 2. Shuko Sandoval. Shuko Sandoval was at a smoke shop in Las Cruces, New Mexico in 2021 when he noticed that a fellow customer was acting suspicious. The man, later identified as 26-year-old Anthony Malone, had been in the store for around an hour, according to a staff member who later told detectives that he kept looking toward the employee entrance as if he were waiting for an opportune moment to get behind the counter. After noticing that the 2 female workers on duty seemed uncomfortable, Sandoval told one of the women that he would stick around until Malone left. At Malone's request, the manager on duty showed him $300 worth of watches from a display case. He tried to grab them from her, but she grabbed them back. Malone then shoved the woman and ran for the store's exit. Sandoval pulled a gun on the unarmed man and told him to stop, but he kept running. The armed customer fired 3 bullets into Malone's chest. He collapsed to the ground, and Sandoval attempted to help him while someone else dialed 911. In what seems like a misguided attempt to stop a criminal from getting away, Sandoval told officers that he was aiming for Malone's shoulder and accidentally struck his chest. He cooperated with law enforcement, but was ultimately charged with second-degree murder. It will now be up to a jury to decide whether the shooting was justified or if Sandoval took things too far. 1. Crystal Whipple. When Crystal Whipple tried to pay for a $35 manicure with a fraudulent credit card at a Las Vegas nail salon in 2018, the card was denied. She told the manager, 51-year-old Nya Annie Nyap Win, that she was going to run outside and grab some cash from her car. Annie saw Whipple starting to drive away and ran outside to try stopping her. She jumped in front of the car, and Whipple hit the gas anyway and mowed the woman down before fleeing the scene. Nguyen died from her injuries after being dragged by the car. Police found the Camaro that Whipple had been driving in the parking lot of a nearby apartment complex. They discovered that it was a stolen rental car. Whipple eluded law enforcement for the next 2 weeks until police caught up with her in Arizona. She was extradited back to Nevada and charged with Nguyen's murder. To avoid going to trial, she pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and received a 10 to 25-year sentence.
11. Charles Cullen. By the time Charles Cullen killed his first victim in 1988, he was in the throes of alcoholism and his life was entangled in a downward spiral. At the time, he was working as a nurse at St. Barnabas Medical Center in Livingston, New Jersey. The first victim was a local judge who came to the emergency room suffering an adverse reaction to a blood-thinning medication when Cullen administered a lethal dose of a drug to him intravenously. It's believed that he killed dozens of people here before he quit in 1992, including an AIDS patient who was overdosed with insulin. For the next 2 years, he worked at Warren Hospital in Phillipsburg, New Jersey, where patients continued to die under suspicious circumstances. This includes 3 elderly women who received overdoses of a heart medication called digoxin. One of these patients accused Cullen of sneaking into her room and injecting her IV with something while she slept, but the hospital dismissed her complaints. Cullen continued to kill at various hospitals into the early 2000s. Although several of his employers suspected him of serious wrongdoing, he avoided legal scrutiny until the death of his final victim in 2003 at the Somerset Medical Center. By then, Cullen's co-workers and superiors had caught him in rooms he wasn't assigned to, ordering drugs for patients they weren't prescribed, and going through patient records that he had no reason to look at. After his first murder arrest, Cullen confessed to killing at least 40 people throughout his 16-year nursing career, although some believe he may have murdered as many as 400 victims. He received 11 life sentences for several of the murders he committed, and it's long enough to ensure that he'll never see freedom again. 10. Dr. Kachi Nobuko. In early 2022, a woman who suffers from epilepsy had a serious seizure and went to the emergency room at the University of Florida Health Leesburg Hospital. Sheila Bryant later told local station WFTV that her eyes were open and she was semi-conscious, but she couldn't say or do anything because of the seizure she was having. The doctor who was tasked with treating her, Kachi Nobuko, allegedly thought Bryant was faking her condition. He hit her in the face repeatedly to try proving that she wasn't really having a seizure. He's also accused of returning to the room and slapping Bryant's face with her hand a second time, causing her IV to rip out of her arm and blood to spray everywhere. The patient was left with visible injuries from being struck in the face. According to one witness, Dr. Nobuko laughed and mocked the patient and didn't stop hitting her until other staff members intervened. He reportedly told police that he was trying a method that's commonly used to see if a patient is faking unconsciousness. It involves holding the person's arm and letting go to see if they resist or have any bodily control. However, several employees claimed that it looked like the doctor was actively hitting Bryant. Nobuko was charged with 3 counts of battery. 9. Elizabeth Johnson. An emergency room doctor from Hoboken, New Jersey, found herself in hot water with the law in early 2022 after she and her roommate were accused of trafficking drugs. 38-year-old Elizabeth Johnson and 31-year-old Sergei Corporan fell under investigation when Corporan sold more than 150 grams of cocaine to undercover cops in several transactions. A search of their apartment turned up at least $15,000 worth of drugs and paraphernalia, including 17 grams of cocaine, 60 ecstasy tabs, and more. Both Johnson and Corporan now face a slew of charges, including multiple counts of possession with the intent to distribute within 1,000 feet of a school. Corporan was also charged with numerous counts of distribution. Johnson's employer of 4 years, the Hoboken University Medical Center, declined to comment, citing an ongoing investigation. 8. Dr. James Arthur Grime. In late 2021, someone began writing anonymous letters to the nurse manager at an emergency room in Corpus Christi, Texas, accusing Dr. James Arthur Grime of being intoxicated on the job. The first note stated that Grime was drowsy and had slurred speech, while the second note claimed that he once again seemed impaired. According to staff members, he was inputting orders incorrectly, seemed confused, lost his balance, and at one point allegedly stumbled into the wrong patient's room. Grime was relieved of duty and sent to take a drug test, but was either unable or unwilling to do it that day. He went the next day and passed, although there were no staff members available to watch him give the sample. A month later, he reportedly refused to give urine for a scheduled drug test because he had eaten. The next day, Grime tested positive for cocaine and a type of controlled sedative called benzodiazepines. He was relieved for another 2 weeks, and the Texas Medical Board temporarily suspended his license until a hearing was held to determine the next steps. 7. William Huel. Chris Allison and her husband Troy were at their Columbus, Ohio home one night in 2018 when Troy started having trouble breathing. He went to the emergency room where he had 2 heart attacks and was then transferred to the intensive care unit, ICU. The doctor on duty, William Huel, told Chris that he thought her husband was brain dead and that he wanted to give the man something to make him comfortable. He was soon dead at just 44 years old. Several months later, the hospital called Chris and said that Troy had been given an overdose of fentanyl. An investigation found evidence that Huel overdosed at least 25 patients with the powerful painkiller. He was fired, lost his medical license, and was initially charged with 25 counts of first-degree murder. Huel's attorney, Jose Baez, argued that he was preventing needless suffering in patients who were close to dying, a practice known as comfort care. 11 counts were quickly dropped, and Huel was brought to trial for the remaining 14 counts. Baez reportedly claimed that his client was scapegoated, and Huel himself maintained his innocence. He stated that he felt the doses he gave were appropriate for the patient's conditions at the time. Ohio's laws also don't specify a maximum dosage of fentanyl, which means that it's generally up to the treating physician to determine a patient's appropriate dose. A jury acquitted Huel of all charges, but he was left with a handful of civil suits from the families of patients who died in his care. He also permanently lost his license and has no other choice but to start his life over from scratch and find a new career. 6. Jennifer Ann Hall. Over a 5-month period in 2002, the Hedrick Medical Center in Chillicothe, Missouri experienced 18 code blue cardiac emergencies. It was a sudden and shocking increase from the facility's average of 1 code blue incident per year. 9 of the patients died and 9 recovered. In 2012, Livingston County prosecuting attorney Adam Warren launched an investigation into the suspicious uptick in code blue events. 10 years later in 2022, authorities charged former respiratory therapist Jennifer Ann Hall with murder for the death of a 75-year-old patient named Fern Franco. The 41-year-old is accused of injecting Franco with lethal doses of succinylcholine, which paralyzes the respiratory muscles and renders a person unable to breathe. Hall also allegedly administered a deadly amount of morphine to the victim. The prosecutor has yet to reveal a motive or whether Hall will face charges in any of the other suspicious deaths that occurred during her employment at the hospital. In the meantime, Hall's attorney, Matt O'Connor, argued that his client didn't have access to the drugs that killed Franco. He claimed that Hall is being scapegoated based on criminal allegations from before she worked at Hedrick Medical Center, including an arson charge for a fire that happened at another hospital in 2001. However, Hall was eventually cleared of that charge. 5. Triple threat. After a 25-year-old mentally impaired man struck a female employee at the South Florida State Hospital in Pembroke Pines in 2014, he was subjected to a brutal assault at the hands of 3 employees. The trio initially took control of the patient to protect the woman he hit, but they allegedly took things too far as soon as the nurses left the area. 54-year-old Mark Anthony Hansen, 47-year-old Osagboro Khalid Samim, and 34-year-old Ramondo Dean Ivy were accused of kicking the man in the head, beating him with a broomstick, and spraying cleaner in his eyes and face. Surveillance footage showed the workers going in and out of the room where the patient was being held. In the video, Ivy can be seen entering the room with an intact broomstick and leaving with it broken in half. Later on, the victim stumbled down the hall while leaning against the wall for support and holding what looked like a bloody towel. A medical report revealed that he had a fractured nose, swollen ears, and scratches on his face and head. According to investigators, the man suffered from schizophrenia and some other issues. The Florida Department of Children and Families got involved and concluded its investigation 2 months later. 2 years later, in 2016, the 3 suspects were all charged with abusing a disabled adult. By then, they were no longer employed at the hospital, and the outcomes of the cases are unclear. 4. Jamie Lynn Patton. A patient who was considered dangerous escaped from a secure ward at Broughton State Mental Hospital in Morganton, North Carolina in 2019. After the incident, authorities quickly began to suspect healthcare technician Jamie Lynn Patton of helping him flee. Other employees had reportedly noticed Patton's unusually friendly relationship with the patient, Joey Clips, and they thought that she'd gotten inappropriately close with him. A judge had placed Clips in the hospital after a mental evaluation found him incompetent to stand trial for charges stemming from a police chase in 2018. He was accused of ramming his car into several police vehicles and was charged with assault with a deadly weapon. Detectives obtained a warrant to search Patton's phone and vehicle for evidence related to Clips' escape. They found that she called a payphone in the hospital several times before Clips fled, and there were various calls to a local motel where Patton and Clips stayed together for 3 nights after he escaped. A motel employee told local station WSOC-TV that the pair seemed pretty normal and that he would have kicked them out if they caused any sort of disturbance. He also said that the staff had no idea that the couple was wanted. Patton was charged with harboring a fugitive and fired from her job, and Clips was apprehended in Virginia. 3. Aisha Basharat. Just minutes after an 83-year-old woman passed away at Heartlands Hospital in Birmingham, England in 2021, a healthcare assistant took her bank card and used it at a vending machine. 23-year-old Aisha Basharat could be seen buying several dollars worth of snacks on surveillance footage. She used the card again later that day, and then tried to use it 4 days later when she returned to work, but the deceased patient's family had cancelled it by then. Aisha still had the card in her possession when she was arrested at work. She allegedly claimed that she'd found the card and said that she'd gotten it mixed up with her own card. However, that was hard to believe since the 2 cards looked a lot different from one another. Even if her story about finding the card were true, the young woman had breached the hospital's policies on how to handle lost patient property. Basharat pled guilty to theft and fraud by false representation and received 2 suspended 5-month jail sentences. Speaking to the press, Detective Constable Andrew Snowden described how the victim's loved ones were distressed to discover her bank card missing while they were trying to come to terms with her death. 2. Royven Alonyaleov. On the afternoon of July 18, 2022, police received a call about an alleged bomb threat at Hudson Regional Hospital in Secaucus, New Jersey. While investigating, they found an arsenal of weapons inside an office closet, including 27 rifles and shotguns, 11 handguns, at least 1 semi-automatic assault rifle, and 14 rounds of ammunition. A few weeks later, authorities arrested 46-year-old Royven Alonyaleov at Newark Liberty International Airport. He's now facing multiple charges, including unlawful possession of an assault firearm and 2 counts of possession of a high-capacity magazine. If convicted on those 3 charges alone, he could face 5 to 10 years in state prison. The hospital where the weapon stash was found is located just a few miles from New York City. Following Alonyaleov's arrest, Secaucus Police Chief Dennis Miller mentioned how the guns pose a risk to public safety, especially considering where they were hidden. He didn't specify how the suspect acquired the weapons or how he got them into the hospital. 1. Crystal Huel. 33-year-old Crystal Huel no longer worked at the Memorial Hospital in Chattanooga, Tennessee, when she allegedly put her old badge on and went there dressed as an employee in 2018. She was later accused of gaining access to the break room by telling a worker that her access code wasn't working. They punched Huel in, at which point authorities claim she stole employees' credit cards. The incident came after Huel pulled the same stunt at a different location, where she snatched a credit card and bought an Xbox with it. After the second theft, detectives reviewed surveillance footage at the hospitals and stores where hundreds of dollars worth of unauthorized purchases were made. Officials later identified Huel as the suspect. She was charged with burglary, 2 counts of theft of property, and 3 counts of fraudulent use of a credit card.
(10) Joe and Shannon Agofsky. On October 6, 1989, There was a different kind of robbery that unfolded at the Stank Bank in Noel, a sleepy town in Missouri. Over $70,000 in cash was taken from the bank while it was closed, and yet there was no sign of forced entry. The alarms hadn't been set off, the windows weren't broken, and the door hadn't been pried open. But that wasn't the only strange part of it. When the thieves were inside the bank, they shot out the surveillance cameras and stole bags full of coins. Even for 1989, that was a pretty bizarre thing to do. The FBI focused their attention on the local bank president, Dan Short. He lived alone in rural Arkansas and wasn't responding to their phone calls. Investigators soon learned that one of his neighbors had seen him be abducted by two individuals and then driven away in a brown van. Days later, on October 11th, a couple fishing on Grand Lake in Oklahoma, about 20 miles or 32 kilometers from the scene of the crime, found Dan Short's body dead in the water. He had been bound to a chair with duct tape, weighted with a huge concrete block, and lowered into the lake. He definitely wasn't supposed to have surfaced so early on. Investigators soon located their main suspects, Joe and Shannon Agofsky. Witnesses the police spoke to said that the siblings had been bragging about stealing a huge number of coins. This was a red flag, and the whole reason the FBI were made aware of their names in the first place. Both of them had alibis, and there was nothing directly linking them to the crimes, and so they walked free. But their freedom didn't last for long. The duct tape that had been used on Dan Short's body contained visible fingerprints. The FBI used these prints and matched them with the Agofsky brothers. And in the fall of 1992, the brothers were sentenced to life in prison plus 5 years. Shannon was given the death sentence in 2004 after slaughtering an inmate at a federal prison in Texas. His brother Joe died in 2013 while still incarcerated. 9. Cannibal Brothers. In 2014, two brothers in central Pakistan were arrested for the second time over accusations of cannibalism. They were arrested on suspicion of consuming dead bodies that they had dug up from a nearby graveyard. Police believe they were grave robbing their victims, then cooking their body parts into disgusting dishes. Their house was raided after the neighbors started complaining about a terrible stench wafting off their property. Plus, their neighbors were already suspicious since they'd seen the brothers, identified as Farman and Arif Ali, hanging around the graveyard at night. Inside the house, the police discovered body parts, a human skull, and cooking instruments that had likely been used in their bizarre culinary adventure. This was the second time they were caught allegedly eating dead people, and we still have no idea what motivated them to do such a thing. What we do know is that under Pakistani law, cannibalism isn't technically a crime, and so the men are only being charged with the crime of dehumanizing a body. 8. The Crypto Heist Brothers. Amir and Rais Kaji, two brothers from South Africa, set up a crypto investment service in 2019 called AfriCrypt. Several years after being in business in April of 2021, at a time when the price of Bitcoin was through the roof, the brothers sent an email to their investors informing them that their company had suffered a hack attack. They asked their investors to please not contact the authorities, or it would slow down their efforts to recover the cash lost in the hacking. Naturally, the investors contacted the authorities anyway. An investigation soon unveiled that the funds from the company had been transferred from South African bank accounts into client wallets, then siphoned from there into untraceable accounts. And since then, the brothers have vanished, and nobody has any idea where they are. Amir and Rais, along with $3.6 billion in accumulated cash from investors, are gone. It turned out to be one of the biggest cryptocurrency heists in history, and the brothers still haven't been tracked down. They, so far, have gotten away with almost $4 billion. 7. Ron and Dan Laferty. Brothers Ron and Dan Laferty were both into the Mormon faith in the 1940s in Utah. They were part of a family of 4 brothers, 2 sisters, and their parents. Their father was an angry man who occasionally beat his wife and even murdered the family dog in front of his kids. He was distrustful of medicine, refused to let his kids go to the hospital even after one of them was shot in the stomach with an arrow, and was undoubtedly the most influential figure in Ron and Dan's lives because when they grew up, they were just like their father. By the 1980s, Ron and Dan had been excommunicated from the Mormon Church. They joined up with a polygamist cult known as the School of Prophets, and in a short span of time, they became the leaders of the church. Once they had gained that status, Ron claimed that he himself had communicated directly with God. This was the beginning of one of the most heinous murders in cult history. Ron proclaimed himself a prophet and said that a revelation from God had instructed him to remove several people from their group. One of the people was his sister-in-law, Brenda Wright Laferty. Another was her 15-month-old daughter, Erica. On July 24, 1984, Ron and Dan ended both their lives. Ron and Dan had been living in their own private world, away from the law and away from any social judgment. But once they committed these awful murders, they found themselves at the mercy of civilized courts. They were both brought to trial, and Dan was sentenced to 2 life sentences with no possibility of parole. Ron was sentenced to death, only to have that conviction reversed. He was deemed unfit to stand trial, sent to a mental hospital, and then retried in 1996. Ron was found guilty and once more sentenced to die. He requested to be killed by firing squad, but would die in prison of natural causes in November of 2019 while still waiting for the execution. He was 78 years old. 6. The 1977 Arizona armored car robbery. A daring armed robbery took place on May 24, 1977, along Interstate 17 in Arizona. Russell Dempsey and Cecil Newkirk were working for Purolator Courier, driving an armored vehicle, when they saw police lights in the rearview mirror. They pulled over, assuming the vehicle behind them was an actual police cruiser. What the drivers didn't realize was that they were about to be held up by the Poland brothers. The Poland brothers killed them, stuffed their bodies into bags, and dumped them in Lake Mead. They also got away with $228,000 in cash from the truck. The FBI canvassed the area and soon found a service station owner who reported something suspicious. He said that he had towed a pickup truck that had accidentally backed into Lake Mead the day after the robbery. The 2 men claimed to be fishing, yet they had no fishing equipment. It was strange, but the service station owner just did his job and didn't argue. The receipt for the bill was signed by Michael Poland. The simple mistake of backing their truck into the lake while dumping the bodies of the 2 armored truck workers was what brought the investigators to Michael Poland's door. On May 18, 1978, a year after the crime, Michael and Patrick Poland were arrested. After a very long and dramatic trial, the Poland brothers were given death sentences. In 1997, Michael Poland attempted to escape. His cell contained an escape plan, the keys to handcuffs, and a lockpick. He only got busted because he tried to bribe a prison guard with $2 million to help him escape. On June 16, 1999, Michael Poland was executed. 9 months later, on March 15, 2000, Patrick Poland was also executed. 5. Owen and Gary Schover. 16-year-old Aranda Briones was last seen on January 13, 2019. She was visiting some friends in the Moreno Valley in California at the time. Her family reported her missing when she didn't arrive home. Some of the first people to be interviewed by the police were brothers Owen and Gary Schover. Owen and Gary, 21 and 25 respectively, were supposed to be Aranda's friends. They told the police that they dropped her off at the community park and then went home themselves. They claimed that when they last saw Rhonda, she was still alive and breathing. But thanks to efforts by the Riverside County Sheriff's Office, these brothers were discovered to be liars. According to Sheriff's Deputy Michael Vasquez, the investigators absolutely destroyed the timeline of events given by the brothers. They used surveillance footage to help dismantle the brothers' lies, and finally had enough evidence to arrest them. Owen and Gary are now being held without bail on charges of murder, even though Rhonda still hasn't been found. It's been over 3 years and they still haven't admitted where her body is, despite the fact that they're looking at life in prison for her murder. 4. Twin bank robbers. On June 28, 2022, Royal Canadian Mounted Police officers in Saanich, BC, responded to a robbery at the Bank of Montreal. This was what the experts call a militarized takeover bank robbery. 2 men walked into the bank armed as if they were going to war. The bank robbers demanded everyone get down on the ground. They brandished high-powered rifles, and they were eerily calm and collected during the whole thing. According to Lisa, one of the women who was in the bank when it was robbed, both the men were almost surreally composed. They weren't agitated. They waited patiently and in complete silence as the vault door was opened, and then they filled their bag with cash. But before the bank robbers could leave, the police showed up, and the Canadian police were not messing around. Almost immediately upon the arrival of the cops, it turned into a violent shootout. The brothers hunkered down inside the bank with people they could have easily taken as human hostages, and they fired at the cops. 6 officers were wounded by the bank robbers, and both robbers were killed in the exchange of gunfire. It was a bloody and brutal battle, though no cops or civilians lost their lives. The bank robbers were later identified as Matthew and Isaac Ochterlony, a pair of seemingly ordinary young men. They were both only 22 years old, locals of British Columbia, and hadn't really gotten in any major trouble their whole lives. A month later, we still don't know what inspired them to arm themselves to the teeth and stick up a bank. 3. John and Tony Reed. In April of 2016, Patrick Shun and his wife Monique Patenaude went missing. The police immediately suspected some kind of foul play, and one of the main suspects was John Reed, their neighbor. The police soon learned that John Reed and his neighbors had been involved in a property dispute in their small town of Oso, Washington. John's property had been destroyed by a mudslide, and he accepted a federal disaster buyout. The buyout meant that his land no longer belonged to him, and yet he continued squatting on it anyway. And this seriously upset his neighbors. And so, John killed them. At least that's according to the testimony his brother Tony recently gave in court. Tony said that John called him up, asked if they could drive across the mountains together, and then admitted during the drive that he had killed his neighbors. With Tony's help, John got rid of the bodies. They drove way up into the Washington Mountains in the dark, then wandered through the woods until they found a spot where a tree had blown over. And there they dug the graves. But it was already too late. The police were searching for John. He had to get out of the country. Tony then went with John to Arizona and crossed into Mexico to hide. But after a little while, Tony became scared that the Mexican police might shoot him if they were found out. So he returned to the American border and gave himself up. He then gave up his brother and led the police to where the bodies were hidden, and he was given 14 months in prison for criminal assistance. John, on the other hand, was captured and given life in prison for murder. 2. The Harps Brothers. The Harps Brothers are considered to be the very first American serial killers. Micaiah Harp and Wiley Harp were murderous outlaws in the late 1700s, operating throughout the American South. And while they were technically cousins, they did pass themselves off as brothers, and there's no way anyone would have known the difference. During the American Revolution, the brothers sided with the British, but they didn't actually care about the British Empire. All they wanted to do was pillage and kill. They burned down farms, assaulted women in their houses, and pillaged the corpses of American patriots. In the year 1780, the brothers joined with British troops to fight battles along the borders of North and South Carolina. Then they abandoned the war, joined up with some Cherokee Indians, and continued their pillaging. They kidnapped the daughter of Captain James Wood, a couple of other young girls, and forced them to be their wives. They retreated to the Cherokee settlement of Nickajack, near modern-day Chattanooga, and for a dozen years lived a simple life with their stolen brides. In 1798, the brothers went on a legit murder spree. They killed 2 men in Tennessee, moved into Kentucky, and killed a pair of traveling men from Maryland. They were entirely motivated by bloodlust, often leaving their victims in despicable states of mutilation. The Harps killed an estimated 40 men, women, and children, and then were eventually caught and killed themselves. A posse tracked them down in 1799, and Micaiah Harp was shot in the back. Wiley Harp got away and was captured 5 years later in 1804, hanged, and his head placed on a stake along the Natchez Road. 1. Hit by a boat. In June of 2022, 2 brothers in Indiana were arrested after one of them drove into a police officer with a boat. It happened after the brothers broke into a floating restaurant on the Ohio River. According to the Madison Police Department, the men were witnessed climbing over the gate and into the Lighthouse restaurant at about 2 o'clock in the morning on June 25th. Officers responded to the scene immediately. The brothers were still inside, but they refused to come out. Seeing no other choice, some of the police then climbed over the gate and tried to arrest the brothers. They managed to get one of them, Evan Meyer, into custody, but the other brother escaped. 45-year-old Stephen Meyer managed to get away into a boat. Then he drove it straight into the dock, where one of the officers was standing. The boat hit the dock and rammed the officer in the shoulder, and then Stephen took off in the boat as quickly as he could. The officer wasn't injured, although it was definitely a jarring experience. The boat was later found abandoned on the beach, and Stephen Meyer was discovered hiding nearby. The brothers are now facing charges of battery on a public safety officer, resisting law enforcement, and public intoxication. We don't know why they thought it was a good idea to rob the restaurant, but it almost certainly had something to do with too much drinking booze. Would you rather have a twin brother or a twin sister as a psychotic killer? Let us know in the comments, and thanks for watching. Remember to hit subscribe, and come back soon for another surprising video.